In 2009, I was located in Bakwa, Afghanistan, on top of a hill overlooking a cemetery. The customs in that part of the world don't dictate for the dead to be buried as they are here in the United States. Instead, they lay their loved ones on the dirt and cover them with piles of rocks with simple sticks and torn clothing as markers for them to visit later on. I was on my post standing watch. It was roughly 2:45 in the morning at that time, and I had been on post since midnight. A rock the size of a golf ball smacked the bulletproof glass just above my machine gun. I used my night vision and thermal imaging to see if anyone was out in front of my post trying to get my attention. There was nothing to be seen, only darkness. I calmed my nerves, drank a few sips of water, told myself to just relax, there was nothing to worry about. 10 minutes passed when, bam, another rock, a slightly bigger one than before, smacked the same spot on the glass. I called my command center and informed them of my situation, asking if they could use the thermal camera from their position to see if anyone was near my post. He informed me that there was no one. With my mind wary and feeling ever more alert, I waited and planned what I would do should it happen a third time. I decided I would exit my post immediately and fire an illumination round into the sky, lighting up my entire area. 15 more minutes passed when, bang, a rock the size of a tennis ball smashed my window. It was immediately followed by more rocks hitting me in the chest, pebbles and dust scattering all over my machine gun. It was time to fire that illumination round and see what was going on once and for all. Then, as I turned around, behind me in the corner of my post stood a towering creature. He was at least 9 feet tall. I froze in place, unable to scream, breathe, blink. It was as if he were in total control of me, as if he were controlling me through my fear. As he stared at me with his deep red eyes, I found myself only able to make out certain things about him. He had 12 total horns, 3 in each side of his face, and 3 coming out of each shoulder. There were crater-like holes in his face, with bugs crawling in and out of them. His arms were abnormally long, his fingers the same, and with giant claws as well. He was terrifying. We continued eyeing each other for what felt like an eternity. Water began rushing from my eyes from the pain of being unable to blink. And when he finally did allow me to blink, when my eyes opened again, he was gone. I gasped for air and jumped from that 10-foot-high post, skipping the ladder completely, and ran straight to the command center. I told the commanding officer, and only him, what I had experienced. I was in Bakwa for an additional 30 days, never once looking back toward that post and never speaking of it to anyone. It wasn't that I didn't want to share my story. It was that I was afraid that if I spoke of him, that he would come back. My second encounter with this demonic entity took place in 2011. I was at a training exercise in the middle of the Mojave Desert. I had been dealing with this unsettling feeling for several days and couldn't understand why. It wasn't so much a sick or nauseous feeling, but more like my senses had been heightened, and I could feel this air of sadness overwhelm me periodically throughout the day. I would catch myself staring off into the distance, trying to figure out what was going on with me. With 2 years having passed since my encounter, and me being back in the States by then, he, never came to mind. On the third night of being unable to shake off this feeling, I laid down on my cot and drifted off to sleep. As I lay there, sound asleep, it felt like someone kicked my cot with all their might. I jolted awake and looked at my watch. It was 3:01. There was one guy awake on the other side of the building on guard duty. The whole area was pitch black aside from 2 glowing exit signs, one of which was just above his head. I rolled over onto my left side, and there he was, up in the corner. Both of his arms were running the length of the walls, and his legs were tucked up to his chest. His bright red eyes froze my body in place. The degree of fear that overcame me physically to this day gives me goosebumps to recall. I tried calling out to the Marine across the way, but I couldn't speak. I tried with every fiber of my being, but not a sound would escape my lips. My eyes were fixated on him. It was the same horrible event all over again. Being unable to blink, breathe, or move. Just as before, time seemed to slow, making it feel as if the whole thing were dragging on perpetually. He never said a word. He doesn't have to. His presence is enough, and he knows that. After some time he vanished, and I was able to move again. I lifted my head off of my soaking wet pillow, then turned face down and prayed until I passed out from exhaustion. My third and final encounter occurred during the summer again, this time in 2013. 4 years from the first encounter, and 2 years from the second. I was going through a rough patch in life. I was getting ready to deploy for the 4th time and was simultaneously going through a tough divorce. My ex-wife was asleep upstairs in our bedroom, and I was watching TV in the living room before bed. I finished relaxing for the night and shut off the lights along with the TV. The only light left was coming from the digital clock on the microwave. I fell asleep shortly after, still laying on the couch, and my mind wandered off into a dream. I was back in high school, sitting in the cafeteria with my friends. I had just finished my meal and looked up from my tray, smiling, when in front of me, standing between the 2 double doors about 60 feet away, was the figure. The sight scared me out of my sleep, but somehow I was still stuck in my dream. My eyes could see my living room, and the dim light from the kitchen over my left shoulder. My front blinds and the street light from the outside shining through it in split sections. I could see my ceiling. Everything around me was crystal clear. I just couldn't move. No matter how hard I struggled to do so, I couldn't even move my arms or legs. I couldn't blink. I couldn't speak. And even though I could see my living room, I was still stuck in his horrible presence. My thought process kept telling me that he was far enough away that maybe I could escape. Back in the dream, I stood up from my table to dispose of my tray and get out through the door to my left. As soon as my foot hit the threshold, though, his hand grabbed my shoulder and I cried out in pain. Each of his fingers were as big as my hand. His nails pierced my skin, his first 4 fingers driving down and into my ribs. I could feel my bones cracking, feel the pop as he punctured my lung as they made their way through my body and out my back. His thumb drove through my spine, snapping it into pieces. I'm lying there in the dream, crying out, tears streaming down my face, as I longed to take in just 1 ounce of oxygen. The sheer agony was what allowed me to break free that time, to blink at last. When I did, I was back in my dreams, only this time we were on a road in the middle of the desert. He was up ahead of me, and my body was being dragged face down across the pavement. I could feel the skin of my face being ripped off as he walked down the road. His arm was fully extended, pushing me toward the ground to inflict more pain, slowly applying more pressure, pushing his hands deeper and deeper into my body, breaking me further and further apart. We came to a row of Joshua trees lining the road. He stopped and looked to the right at a massive weeping willow off to the side and began dragging me through the sand toward it. The sun started to rise in the distance between two mountains. He took a few steps forward, embracing the heat of the sun and raising his arms, extending them out to the sides. I could see the entire outline of his figure, and I will never forget the smell of his burned flesh as the breeze passed. He turned around and faced me, his huge, glowing red eyes feeling as if they were burning through me. All I wanted in that moment was to be able to close my own eyes, so that I didn't have to see him. But it wasn't an option. My body once again would not allow it. He raised his left hand and opened his fingers wide, swinging his arm toward me. As I'm lying there, hoping that he won't kill me with a single blow, he drove his hand down into the roots of the tree and ripped out the bottom section. He tossed it to the side as millions of red and black ants began pouring out of the earth at the base of the trunk. The ants engulfed my body, crawling under me as if they meant to carry me away. Then, at what seemed to be him having given them permission to do so, they began consuming my body. I could feel each bite as he stood over, watching me suffer. I could still feel my brain telling my body to move, but my body was still paralyzed. My eyes felt like they hadn't shut in an hour. My pillow was so soaked from tears you could probably have wringed it out. He walked toward me, placing one leg on each side of my body. He tilted his head toward the sky, opening his mouth to expose the giant fangs within, screamed, and bent at the waist. Just before his teeth reached my face, I snapped out of paralysis and ran screaming to my kitchen from the perceived pain of the ant bites. I could still feel that and them crawling on me. I flipped on the lights as I ran, then turned on the water. I used the hose to spray my body down in the middle of the floor. My ex-wife came running down the stairs, screaming at me in a panic, asking what was going on. A few months later, I was having a dream of someone guiding me toward a black box that I sent home from my second tour in Afghan. They led me to the box in my garage where it was being stored, and inside that box was a smaller box. As I was opening it, I woke up to a voice saying salvation. A little backstory here. Prior to every foot patrol I went on during the 15 months I spent in that country, I put on a bandana. Printed on that bandana was a verse from Psalms. The next day, when I went into the garage, I opened the box, and lo and behold, inside was my bandana. A week or so later, I tattooed this on my chest. I have yet to encounter the entity again. I was terrified in 2017, knowing the pattern of him visiting me every 2 years. But time has continued to pass, and he has continued to stay away. I don't know if it's truly faith that's granted me protection, or if he simply moved on. Either way, I'm grateful to be rid of the red-eyed demon. I'm a hunter. Though I have been deer hunting and have been known to get a turkey for Thanksgiving, I mostly hunt boar. For those of you who don't know, boar are a big problem in the United States. A sow can have 2 litters a year, and it's not uncommon for a litter to consist of 10 or more piglets. Given that pigs eat anything and everything, it's not hard to see why the Department of Fish and Wildlife makes it legal to hunt them with almost no restrictions. In my state, it's illegal to hunt for most large mammals with night or thermal vision scopes, with the exception of boar and coyote. I had been saving for a year, mostly fun money. It's hard to explain to your wife that a scope costs twice as much as the rifle that you're mounting it on, but I did it. There was an area that was peppered with boar activity, and I knew that it would be perfect for a night hunt. It was accessible with my truck, and had plenty of easy-to-find spots where I could set up that overlooked a large clearing. Everything started off uneventful. It was mostly me tinkering with my new toy, cycling through the settings. I was a little impatient. I had spotted multiple deer, but they were out of season, and like I mentioned earlier, my current setup wasn't legal for deer. I moved to another spot that I had come upon days prior. It probably wasn't much better than my first, but it gave me something to do and a new angle to look around from through the new scope. After another hour or so of glassing the area, it dawned on me that there wasn't much animal activity at all. No rabbits or owls, and the deer that I had seen before were hundreds of yards away from where I was. Why was this pocket of land so dead at night, yet so lively during the day? When I set up, it was around 10 p.m., and it was around 2 in the morning when I started to think about packing up, maybe setting up a target before I left, and taking some practice shots. That's when I heard a crunch coming from behind me. I panned my scope over and saw the silhouette of a small bear pushing through the bushes. It's important to note that my scope isn't exactly night vision. It's a thermal scope, kind of like a black and white version of what you see in the movies. I adjusted my range, zoomed in a little. I remember getting startled when I saw that it wasn't really a bear, but a man. Because of how low and hunched over he was in the underbrush, I had mistaken him for a young bear. I wondered if it might have been a game warden, but it couldn't be. I would have seen the headlights coming up the road from where I was perched. And where would he have walked in from? I was 30 miles away from anything and on public lands. I was about to call out when I adjusted my sights again and noticed that he was naked. I remember being disturbed by his movements. He was twitching and jerking around like a squirrel, grabbing at the foliage, sniffing around and palming a tree. I couldn't be 100% certain, but I could have sworn that it was the same tree that I had been leaning against earlier. Could he smell me? The thought was terrifying. Then he did something that I still have nightmares about. He squatted and placed his hands in the dirt between his feet, then stared straight up at the sky like a dog mid-howl. And I heard it. A voice coming from that direction. A very compelling female voice, crying out for help, saying that she was lost. There was a long pause. Neither of us moved a muscle. The center of my sights was trained at the dirt in front of his feet. I couldn't bring myself to aim directly at another person. It went against everything that I had been taught about firearms. Was this person truly lost? Was it some guy who had gone crazy out here in the woods? Why was the voice so feminine? It called out again, this time begging more desperately, claiming to be unable to walk. This, I knew, was a lie. Not only could he walk, when I first saw him he was traversing the land with ease, especially for a naked person. So much so that I had mistaken him for an animal. It had to be a trap. This guy or this thing was trying to lure me in with a damsel in distress routine. Luckily, because of the lack of activity before, I had already packed up most of my gear. I took my eyes off of him for a moment to get my pack. I buckled my chest strap, scrambled for my rifle. To my horror, he was in the exact same position, but his face was staring in my direction, and he was smiling. To add more off-putting effect to the scenario, the thermal scope makes animal eyes appear white. Then, I began to wonder how he had heard me get up and put my gear on. He was at least 150 yards away. I screamed in that direction for him to leave. He stood upright, and it hit me how tall and skinny that he was. He was over 6 feet tall, very lean. He took a couple of long strides in my direction, and I instinctively sent a round sailing above his head into the tree line. He was freaky, but he hadn't really threatened me. What would I have told the cops? I was just unwilling and unready to shoot someone. He stopped dead in his tracks and got back down on all fours. I yelled at him that the next bullet would bring him down, and this time I had my sights trained on the center of his abdomen. His eyes were just above the grass like a large cat. I was trying to stop my hand from trembling, and I knew that my voice had cracked a little on that last warning. What can I say? I had surpassed the worst levels of fear that I had experienced up to that point. The standoff lasted only a minute, maybe 2, but it felt like forever. In an instant he bolted left toward the tree line opposite the road. He moved so fast that I could barely keep him in my scope. He disappeared into the brush, and I sent another bullet sailing high in his direction. I racked another round, and tried to pocket that mag, swap it out for a fresh one, but I dropped it and didn't bother to look for it. I wasn't far from my truck, and more than anything, I wanted to get out of there. I could hear him in the distance, screaming and making this weird sound that could either have been a laugh or a cry. I hauled ass up the trail and arrived at my truck, breathless. I tossed my gear into the cab, but kept the rifle in the passenger seat and sped off. For the longest time I only told that story from the perspective of having spotted some deranged crackhead living off the land as a caveman. I reported it to Fish and Game, but all they did was scold me for hunting at night alone, and I never received an update. It wasn't until I told this story while on a camping trip that my nephew told me about Wendigos, rakes, and skinwalkers. My story nearly made him come out of his skin because the spot where we were camping was technically part of the same forest where I had seen the creature, just 50 miles east of the exact spot. He was so spooked that his mom, my cousin, had to take him home. She wasn't happy, to say the least. Since then, I've gone down the rabbit hole with these scary stories. I'm not saying that what I saw definitely was a cryptid. I'm saying that if such a thing exists, I may have dodged quite the bullet myself that night. This has been an ongoing series of encounters taking place over the last decade of my life. I'm a believer in the paranormal world due to other experiences, but I'm also open to the fact that this could just be sleep deprivation or stress-induced. Still, the amount of times that I've dealt with this, and the fact that I have been consciously awake each time, makes me wonder. I'm 30 years old now, and my first encounter began in 2012, while I was a freshman at college. I was on academic probation over a long weekend, so the rest of my roommates were gone and I was stuck in the dorm by myself. One night after I had finished my homework and was tired of mindlessly scrolling through my phone, I became unusually tired and fell asleep in my bed around 8 p.m. with the lights on. After about 20 minutes into my snooze, I got this feeling like I wasn't alone and I jolted awake. Our beds were over our desks in a bunk configuration. I rolled over and looked into the middle of the room below me and was shocked to see a humanoid figure curled up in the fetal position. I thought I was dreaming, so I just continued to blink and rub my eyes and was telling myself to wake up. But soon I realized that I wasn't dreaming. After about 30 seconds, it seemed to register that I was staring at it, and it slowly stood up. I was utterly frozen. It looked just like a person, but with no face or hair, clothes, no real features at all. Just an opaque human form. Nothing discernible about it other than its generalized shape. Once it reached its full height, it was close to 6 feet tall. It began walking in my direction. Nothing felt evil or malicious about it, but I didn't want to test that theory. Unfortunately, it was between me and the door, and I had to run past it to escape my room. I yelled at it to stop approaching me. It came within 3 feet before my fight-or-flight instinct overrode me being frozen in fear. I then jumped from my bunk onto the floor and bolted past it. It never reached out or interfered with me running out into the halls, filled with pure adrenaline. I calmed myself down and went to find one of my friends down the hall who had also stayed behind for the weekend. I didn't tell said friend about my experience, not wanting to sound insane. I chalked it up to stress with school and being tired, but unfortunately no matter what it was, I still had to eventually make my way back to my dorm to sleep, and I had to do it alone. I finally summoned up the courage after a few hours. I entered my room, and nothing was there. I stayed awake with the lights on the rest of the night, constantly uneasy even though nothing else happened. Fast forward to 2013. Every year we were required to switch rooms, so my roommate and I had recently done just that. Nothing happened until late fall. This time, all of my roommates were present. It was a school night, and all 3 of us had just begun to fall asleep. Once again, I got that uneasy feeling. I rolled over like before, this time to find the humanoid figure standing near the head of my bed, reaching toward me. I freaked out and woke up my roommates, who threw on the light. As soon as the darkness was taken from the room, it disappeared. Justifiably annoyed, my roommates told me that I was just imagining things, that I needed to go to sleep. These encounters occurred 2 more times while I was in college, with the last incident taking place during my senior year. It was the same routine repeated. I fell asleep, then woke up with the same uneasy feeling. That night, without meaning to, I had left my closet door open, and as I peered into it, I saw the figure again, just standing there, staring into me. I fixated on it, telling myself that it was just my overactive imagination. But as I continued wishing it away, it stepped out of the closet and, like the other times, began approaching me. I screamed at it, demanding that it not take another step, and it vanished into nothingness. Not long after that, I graduated and joined the military. I was still under the belief that it was nothing more than college-induced stress. I felt like the encounters would end on their own, especially with me leaving my dorm for my first duty station in Florida. At that point, I was engaged to my now wife, and we had 2 dogs. No matter which house or apartment that we would move to, the shadow people would continue to follow me. I would never be able to escape the horrifying encounters. It would always start with my dogs growling at our bedroom doors, followed by full manifestations. My wife would awake to me shouting at something, ordering it not to come any closer and to leave my family and I alone. It would both terrify and confuse my wife, as she's never been able to see the figures for herself. With each visitation, the entity would come a little closer before disappearing after my confrontations. It would always get close, but it would never quite reach me. Somehow I could sense that it was never actually the same shadow person, or perhaps I could say that its intent was never the same. Each time it appeared to me, it grew more foreboding, its will toward me intensifying in its negativity. There was also this almost gravitational pull that it had to it, but not as if it were drawing me to it, more like the other way around. It was being drawn to me. This happened 5 more times between 2017 and 2019. That said, allow me to lead now into my final encounter with these shadow people. It happened in 2020. My wife was pregnant with my son at the time, and I was a month out from deployment. The last encounter was different from the rest. It was the single most terrifying, stress-inducing paranormal event that I have ever witnessed. I was asleep with my wife in bed. I had only been asleep for an hour when I woke up because I couldn't breathe. I could physically feel that there were 2 hands wrapped around my neck and a weight pressing down on my chest. As I struggled for oxygen, I saw the entity above me actively trying to suffocate me. I hadn't yet registered that a shadow person was what it was. I thought it to be a home invader. I wrestled with it, could feel it and grab it. Once I got the upper hand, it sprung to the bedroom floor and crawled under my bed. My wife was already awake, as I had been thrashing around. I still thought that it was an intruder and was trying to find a weapon. I told my wife to escape the house and call the cops. She of course refused and told me that it was all a bad dream. Then I looked under the bed to find nothing. My wife told me that I was just stressed with the upcoming deployment. I was incredibly embarrassed on top of being utterly terrified. I still saged the house just in case and tried to work on my stress using a variety of methods. I haven't had another encounter since. I know this could have all been psychological, but that doesn't take away from the emotions felt in those moments. I'm never half awake. I've always been fully alert while experiencing these encounters. I've never dealt with any troubles such as sleep paralysis or sleepwalking. I don't share this story unless I know the person or people I'm telling it to are believers in the paranormal. I know to the ears of a skeptic my ordeal seems completely fabricated, and I wouldn't believe it either. I know what I experienced, though, and I know how it made me feel. In the winter of 2015, I was honorably discharged from the United States Army after serving one tour in Afghanistan as a turret gunner on a security forces mission. I spent 5 years in the Army and obtained the prestige of being an infantry parachutist, most commonly referred to as a paratrooper. I spent my last 2 years in the Army, stationed at Fort Belvoir, located in Alexandria in Fairfax County. There, I went through the medical separation process because of post-traumatic stress disorder set on by my 2012 deployment in eastern Afghanistan. Fort Belvoir is home to one of the military's finest hospital and healthcare detachments. It was during this time that I started to get acquainted with the Washington, D.C. metro area. During the summer of 2014, I went home to visit my family in Rhode Island for my 21st birthday. Since I was still active duty, it was necessary to fill out a DA-31 form to request authority to take leave. Form in hand, I traveled back home with the intention of staying gone for 2 weeks. As I was on my way, however, I was robbed at gunpoint and set up by 3 individuals who knew that I was carrying cash on my person. I was shot once in the upper leg, shattering my femur and causing me to lose over 3 liters of blood. If the bullet had been a centimeter off, it would have severed the femoral artery, and I wouldn't be around to write this. After emergency surgery at a Rhode Island hospital, I was transferred back to my unit at Belvoir. I had to do intensive physical therapy to regain the use of my leg. With such a traumatic injury, I was left crippled and had to learn how to walk again. I spent months in a wheelchair, then weeks using a walker and a cane. Come January of 2015, I was discharged, and civilian life began. I didn't want to move back home to Rhode Island, so I decided to find an affordable apartment there in D.C. For those who don't know the layout of D.C., it is separated into 4 quadrants resembling the shape of a diamond. You have northwest, southwest, northeast, and southeast. Both the northeast and the southeast sections of the city have an infamous reputation for having crime-ridden, drug-infested neighborhoods. But, because it suited my economic interests at the time since I was living on a modest budget, I decided to move into a rundown apartment in the northeast quadrant right on the county line. The first month there was uneventful. Nothing felt strange or amiss. I never got any bad feelings. There were never any off vibes. There was a bus station at the bottom of my street that ran directly to the Minnesota Avenue metro station. It was quite convenient. The first incident to occur was with my kitchen cabinets. After waking up early and walking into the kitchen, I noticed all the cabinet doors were wide open. I knew with certainty that they were all closed when I had gone to bed. I like to keep things orderly in my house. I'm one to scrutinize. I have a great capacity for attention to detail. Still, though, I convinced myself that I wasn't 100% positive, and that the only logical explanation could be me having left them open by accident, that I simply forgot. A few weeks later, I started dating a woman from Washington, D.C. who lived nearby. She was older than me and had 3 children, 2 of whom were girls who lived with her and would frequently visit my residence. After a few visits, the girls began telling their mother and myself that they got creepy, uncomfortable vibes from my apartment. Vibes that included the feeling of being watched or overall dread. Even their mother expressed those same feelings to me on occasion. That's when the electronics around the house started to malfunction. My Xbox would turn on and off on its own. My TV would turn on, blaring music on the highest setting while I was in bed. Once again, I was being a skeptic. I pushed aside the mishaps, contributing them to what was probably faulty wiring in the apartment building. But one day, that would change. I remember coming home late one night after a long work day and spending time with my girlfriend at her apartment. I was especially tired that night and hopped into the shower after eating some leftovers. Then I lay down on the couch to watch TV until my eyes began to close. I decided it was time to move into the bedroom and get some proper rest. Aside from a stream of light coming from the street lamp outside my window from the city sidewalk, my room was pitch black. I remember laying there, tossing and turning, trying to get comfortable, when suddenly a black mass began to form in my doorway. I attempted to grab my sidearm from where it was resting on my nightstand, but I couldn't bring myself to lift my hand or to turn away. I was frozen, primordial fear completely overwhelming me. The figures concentrated a deep gaze in my direction, and it seemed that they were almost communicating with each other, plotting evil deeds, no doubt. Then the tallest one, the one that I can only describe as having been the leader, levitated across the room and stopped directly in front of my face. The entity was a thick, black mass, with the shape and outline of a human who stood over 6 feet tall. It wasn't that the figure was just black, either. It was as if it were the absence of light. It wasn't transparent. It placed its pitch-black face against mine, and made a hissing sound that I will never forget. Never have I encountered something so real and so terrifying. After it made that horrid noise, it levitated back toward the other figures. I can only speculate this, but I suspect that they were feeding on the essence of my fear. Fear that I knew was radiating from my every pore. And then, satisfied, they turned around and left my room in single file. It was at that exact moment that I was able to move and finally grab a hold of my sidearm. I went from room to room, clearing each corner, as I had been trained to do in the army. I truly believed, or perhaps in retrospect simply wanted to, that these entities were human intruders. The situation had me so shaken. I had never been physically paralyzed like that before by fear, and never have been since. I ended up moving back home to Rhode Island shortly after the incident. Nothing like that, nothing paranormal in general, has happened to me again. A few times I've tried to make sense of the ordeal. I've done research on sleep paralysis and shadow people. The reason I don't believe it was a simple case of sleep paralysis or a dreamlike hallucination produced by my own brain is because I hadn't fallen asleep prior to the intrusion. My paralysis had been caused by fear, and fear alone. I work part-time security at an outpatient facility. On average, I work at the hospital about 6 times a month. I can go weeks without anything happening, then for no apparent reason have a night where something is constantly going on. Some of these things can be rationalized. Others, not so much. I do bi-hourly checks throughout a 12-hour shift. This requires me to walk around the facility, make sure that the doors are locked, even if I know that I already locked them. Basically document anything that might happen. Hospitals in general always come with some capacity of despair. I've worked at this hospital for maybe 6, 7 months, and I don't have an incredible knowledge of the lore here. On most nights, I'm here with 2 nurses and a maximum of 3 patients on average. These nights are typically uneventful. Then, at least once every 2 months or so, I have to guard the facility by myself. There are 2 stories that I'm aware of. One is about a patient who passed away unexpectedly at the end of one of the corridors. I constantly have to open that door because it closes by itself. I'll open it, and when I go to do my checks, it will be closed again. I put this to the test one night. I opened it, then walked in a circle around the corridor. By the time I made it back around, it was already closed again. One of the older nurses had a son who passed away in the hospital after a surgery. That's a sad occurrence as it is, but before she quit, she said that she could sense her son's presence in the room that he passed away in. At the time, I assumed it was a coping mechanism on her part. But in that room, I can occasionally see a shadow moving from one corner to the other. These were all the things that you can possibly talk me into rationalizing to some degree. As for the next 3 things, I would have to be persuaded a bit harder. First, the thing that got me looking over my shoulder for a while. It happened when I went into the break room to make a pot of coffee. My back was turned toward the open room, and as I was fumbling around for cream and sugar, I heard what sounded like furniture being dragged across the tile floor. I turned around, fully expecting to get no closure whatsoever regarding the sounds, but instead had the pleasure of witnessing a chair move a good 1.5 feet on its own. I got out of there and went back to my post. I didn't bother with the coffee. Didn't know what else to do. The next thing was in the form of an apparition. I had never seen anything like it before, and it bothered me for days afterward. I was conducting my rounds of the facility, making my way down the same corridor that I had mentioned earlier. I checked a few of the rooms, then turned to leave. When I did, I saw a white, shrouded figure standing in the doorway about 5 feet ahead of me. I dropped my keys and flashlight on the ground and sort of tripped into the adjacent room. I was processing what it was, but when I looked back, the doorway was empty. On further observation, there was no one else in the hallway, which I already knew, but needed to confirm what I saw. I further inspected the room, and also did a recheck of the facility for my own reassurance. Nothing. I was the only one on the premises. This last recollection is hands down what scared me the most. There is a storage room in the middle of the hospital. I hate this room for a variety of reasons, the main one being that whoever designed the plans for the building stuck the light switch in the very center. When I have to turn it off, I then have to navigate my way back out in the dark. The room is pitch black once the lights are out. One night I went into the room to make sure the back door was locked. When I shut off the lights to close it down, in my ear, clear as day, I heard, "Shh." I could feel the physical presence of someone behind me. My ears reacted the way they would as if somebody was really right in my ear, speaking in a forced whisper. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's the only way that I can describe it. I made sure that I was out in the hallway before shining my light back into the room. Again, nothing. Later, I put a small figurine of the Virgin Mary in that room, underneath one of the shelves, as well as a medal of St. Francis de Sales that I got from my confirmation about 12 years ago. Since doing that, I haven't had any more experiences while I'm in there. I welcome any and all skepticism. I'm skeptical myself in most instances. But this is what a hospital night shift can entail. There are knocks. There are footsteps. There definitely seems to be a presence here, and I am not the only one who has experienced it. This happened in August of 1998. My father had been battling lymphoma for about 8 months, and while he appeared to be in remission, the lymphoma came back 8 days after his blood test showed him being cancer-free. Within a week, he had passed. The night before he passed, he was admitted to the hospital. Not wanting him to be alone, my grandmother and I took the first shift of staying up with him. The following morning at 7, my mom and aunt came, and I dropped my grandmother off at her house, then went back home to get some sleep. My then husband kept our 16-month-old daughter busy while I rested, but I could hear them in the living room. Our 2 German shepherds were napping with me, but the bedroom door was open so they could go in and out. We had curtains on a slider, but they weren't blackout ones, so the room wasn't totally dark. I passed out almost immediately. I wasn't just exhausted from staying up all night, but because my parents had relied on me heavily as an only child when my dad got sick. My mom had a hard time coping and was incredibly depressed, so many of the things that they needed to deal with, such as doctor's appointments and obtaining information, I handled. I was also working full-time and going to college full-time, and we had our toddler at home. At some point in the late morning or very early afternoon, something woke me. I wasn't sure what it was, but I looked over at my bedside clock, then back up at the ceiling, debating whether I should go ahead and get up or not. I could hear my husband and daughter in the living room, and the dogs were no longer in the bedroom. I felt strange, like something was wrong. Wrong beyond what was happening with my dad, but like when I was a small child, terrified of the dark. Only it wasn't dark at all. It was midday. I became aware of a soft clicking sound. It took me a few seconds to realize that it was unfamiliar. At that moment, I saw him peek around the corner from the hallway, upside down on his hands and knees on my ceiling. He was a man, only 2.5 to 3 feet tall, wearing a suit and a brimmed hat. While he was 3-dimensional, it was like he was made from shadow. At first, I just stared at him in disbelief. Then that morphed into a terror so profound I could not move or scream. He crawled into the room like he wasn't expecting to be seen, and once he was a few feet inside, he looked down in my direction, then stopped as if in surprise. I think his visibility to me shocked him. He then began crawling closer to my bed, still looking down at me the entire time as if now he was curious about how such a thing could be. Not to say that sometimes these things want to be seen, but I am certain that they choose whether they can be seen or not, and this being had clearly intended to stay hidden. Now he wanted to know why I could see him anyway. I tried again to scream or to move, but I was still frozen in that debilitating state of fear and disbelief at what was happening. I told myself in my head that I must be dreaming, although I did not feel as if I were dreaming, and on willing myself to wake up, nothing changed. All the while, I could hear my husband and daughter still watching TV. Suddenly the phone rang, and my husband got up to answer it. Apparently that snapped me out of my paralyzed state, and I sat straight up in bed. The shadow thing was gone, as was the clicking sound. When I looked at my bedside clock again, only a couple of minutes had passed. Then my husband came into the room, and I knew why before he even said anything. My aunt was on the phone to tell me that my dad was gone. The Shadow Man encounter was instantly put out of my mind while we went to the hospital, and the next few days were spent dealing with funeral arrangements and grief. I remember consciously telling myself that it was a dream, and that I had to believe that as the truth, or I would never be able to sleep again. I did my best to push it out of my memory. That was over 20 years ago. Recently I thought about it again, however, when my now adult daughter had a sleep paralysis incident and experienced the old hag phenomenon. Those occurred only at one specific location, never before or since, but it was when she told me of her experience that it brought back these recollections for me. I believe that this was a non-human entity. I think that these entities feed on human emotions, such as pain or fear, and that this specific entity fed off of sadness and grief, which was very much present in the equation due to the situation with my dad. I think that they can be seen when they want to be, as I mentioned before, but that for some unknown reason I was able to see him regardless. I have a theory that these are the same creatures that Christians call demons, and that Muslims call jinn, and that while some are malevolent, others are not necessarily so. I'm not sure what the one I encountered was, and he certainly didn't cause me grief, but without question was there to feed off of it. Because this is an ongoing client of my company with numerous legal investigations currently under review, some facts have been altered, including the name of the apartment building. In the summer of 2022, a resident was found deceased of a narcotics overdose inside the apartment where this story takes place. A year after the death, in January of 2023, a new resident moved in. I've worked all over town and have no issue with general homelessness, but this particular area does have a lot of problems with drug addiction in the homeless population. We were hired several years back due to people constantly breaking into the buildings to use, along with other types of incidents that I'm not at legal liberty to speak on. It was during this last summer, the summer of 2022, when the overdose occurred in the southern-facing third-floor apartment. It had been suspected by us, meaning security, property management, and the local police department, that the resident had been using and dealing drugs out of the apartment for some time before he passed away. I remember feeling relieved on the night that it happened that I wasn't working, but that's beside the point. I'm jumping now to February of 2023. I arrived at the property and began my regular check. As I approached the third-floor landing, on the south side stairwell, an irate woman rushed toward me. She thought that I was the police, and started telling me that she saw me pull onto the property and told 911 dispatch that an officer had arrived. I informed her that I was just armed security, contracted by property management, but that I could assist, depending on the situation. "Well, I recently moved in, only a few weeks ago now," she said. "But someone has locked themselves in my bathroom, and I live alone," she stated, her voice frantic. I know my facial expression became one of annoyance because I was thinking about the several months that it had taken to repair the door frame and secure the entrance to the apartment after the previous resident. I thought of how during that time that we had to clear the apartment several times a night because people would manage to get inside. I looked at the woman. "I'll take a look," I told her. "Go ahead and call back emergency services and let them know you're with security." I called out to my dispatcher to inform them that I was going into the apartment and to have a cover officer start heading my way. As I entered the unit, I noticed the air inside the apartment felt heavy. It was foreboding, unwelcoming. These are small efficiency apartments. 1 bedroom, a kitchen, a small living room, and a tiny bathroom. I had been inside this specific apartment a lot in the past 6 months, so I knew the layout well and went directly to the bathroom door. The whole way I was thinking about how the bathroom door was just inside the bedroom, so if someone had gotten in, they would have had to climb in through the window, which for this place wouldn't be entirely surprising. Sure enough, the door was locked, the light off from what I could see underneath it. Just as I walked back to the landing where the new resident was still standing, waiting for me, my cover officer arrived. I started asking her why she thought that someone was inside her bathroom, and if maybe she had just accidentally locked herself out. She got frustrated and loudly stated that she wasn't crazy, that she had heard a man inside the bathroom mumbling and going through the cabinets. I glanced at the officer with a "you're probably not needed" look, when we heard an echoing groan come from the doorway of the apartment. The officer and I both rushed inside and ran to the bathroom door. I started knocking on it, hard, issuing orders that the individual exit immediately. Shortly after I issued this command, police officers came into the room. The supervisor asked what was happening, and I explained what I already knew. The police supervisor also knew the apartment well, as he had been there multiple times to take control of detained individuals from when the door was broken. As the 5 of us stood outside the bathroom, we heard the tub and the sink faucet both running. One of the cops made a joke that the subject must really want a bath, and we all chuckled. Then we heard a man sobbing. At this time, a property maintenance person arrived, and the police confirmed with the resident that they were permitted to make entry. Myself and the other security officer decided to wait in the stairwell with the resident. Almost immediately, we heard one of the cops saying, "What in the paranormal activity crap is going on?" And hearing that, I laughed. I looked at the woman and told her that no one was inside the bathroom. My cover officer mentioned to her that the last tenant had passed away inside the apartment, and the resident looked at us with concern. We learned that she hadn't been notified upon signing her lease. We let the police speak to her and the maintenance guy, and we stepped outside for a quick smoke while we waited for the police to come back out. "It's kind of messed up they didn't tell her about that before she moved in," my cover officer was saying. I agreed, but it wasn't our responsibility, and there was nothing we could do. The police came outside and started giving us the basic information we needed for our reports. The supervisor started off by saying, "I don't believe in ghosts, but that was creepy." He then went on to tell us that when they entered, the cabinet doors were open. The toilet was in the process of flushing by itself, and the sink and tub were both indeed running. "Oh, is that all?" I asked, joking. Then one of the other cops showed us a picture of the bathroom on his phone. The mirror cabinet was open, and everything in it had been knocked out into the sink and onto the counter. Both toilet paper rolls were completely rolled out. It looked like an earthquake had hit the room. I just chuckled again. "What in the paranormal activity?" I said, and they both laughed. A week later, I was working that same shift again and arrived at the building. While I was there, I found out that the apartment was already up for rent again. I hope that resident got her deposit back. This happened quite a few years ago when I lived in Washington, D.C. I had just moved into my friend's place, an old house near the city center. It had a basement where our band would practice, a ground floor with a living room and kitchen, and an upstairs with 3 bedrooms. The other 2 roommates my friend shared the place with were a couple. A few months after I moved in, the woman, Annie, announced her pregnancy, and we all celebrated. It was after that, however, that weird things began to happen. One of the first things was that both together and individually, we all started to think that we heard footsteps upstairs, as well as coming down the stairs. We lived near an area where there was a lot of crime and drug-related activity, and the city was going through a bad crime wave at the time as well, so there was the very real possibility of someone breaking into the house. But that was never the case. Over a period of several weeks, the footsteps event increased until they were a nightly occurrence. Then we started seeing a figure. This we all saw individually when we were alone, but we all had the same experience. It was what appeared to be a young woman in turn-of-the-century clothing. We saw her so many times that it almost became laughable in its predictability, and we never felt really scared, until one night when Matt and I, the other roommate and partner of Annie, were out at another band practice. Annie called us in a panic. She was at home alone, and she said that it sounded as if someone was throwing things around. She thought that someone really had broken in that time, and she called the police. We raced through the whole 45-minute drive back home. The police came. They found nothing. Everything was fine downstairs, and no windows or doors were ajar or showed signs of having been tampered with. We all thought of the ghostly experiences we'd been having, and how this seemed to be a definite escalation. The sounds of walking, seeing a strange figure, and the noises in the basement all continued. Soon, though, we all noticed that Annie was having more individual experiences than the rest of us. Another thing that happened was that once, when Annie and Matt were in bed, they both saw a red ball of light fly from one corner of the room to the other. It terrified them both. I wasn't at home at the time when that happened, but they told me about it later. As a side note here, I don't know if this played a role or not, but Matt and I are both atheists, very skeptical. Annie, on the other hand, grew up in the South. She was very superstitious, very spiritual, though not religious. Everything slowly kept ramping up. More and more activity was going on. Annie discovered that she was having twins, but that unfortunately they were both weak and small, and would most likely be born very prematurely. Her newfound knowledge added a layer of anxiety and sadness to the atmosphere in the house. Not long after she was given the bad news, she had the idea to go and visit a so-called psychic. At the time, I was very anti, and so was Matt, and neither of us really wanted to go, but we all did. She told us that the ghosts were spirits who weren't sure if they wanted to come into this world again. She believed in reincarnation. I didn't pay attention to any of it, because like I said, I just wasn't a believer in that kind of thing. Although the strangeness of the haunting stuff was beginning to get to me a little. Then I had my own worst personal experience. Annie and Matt were gone for the night to stay at Matt's parents' house. I was there alone. It was close to sundown when the noise of things being thrown around kicked off in the basement. Then the power went out. I called some friends who lived a few blocks away and asked if I could come over. They said sure, so I did. I walked up the 4 flights of stairs to their apartment, and I kid you not, as they opened the door, their power went out, and 2 large paintings hanging on their wall fell. I never would have believed it had I not been there. I started going into complete panic mode, thinking whatever this was had followed me. I asked if I could spend the night anyway. Nothing else happened until a little after 2 a.m. when we could all hear someone walking back and forth down the street, whistling. As I mentioned before, there are plenty of addicts and criminals in the area, so it could have been someone like that. But when we looked out the window, we could see no one. We were all incredibly scared. Things like that kept happening at the house too, and then, one night, Annie had to be rushed to the hospital. After a very dangerous few hours where losing the babies was a possibility, she gave birth. The twins weren't healthy and had to stay in the hospital for 3 months, if I remember correctly. When they finally got to come home, each had an oxygen tank, and they were sickly for their first year. But after they were born, all of the weird, ghostly events stopped. Everything. I've only had a handful of things happen to me in my life that I would describe as unusual. I'm still extremely skeptical toward a great many things, but this I was never able to explain away. One night while I was pregnant with my second child, my young son came into our room scared, asking if he could sleep with us. We obliged, but being heavily pregnant, I just couldn't get comfortable having a wriggly 2-year-old squeezed into bed next to me. I swapped out with him and went to sleep in his bed. At the time, our cluster of houses was having driveway repairs, and for a month we had to park down an empty adjacent driveway, then walk through a hedge to get to our house. It was a big concrete area with grass at one end that led out onto a river. That said, I'm in my son's room, and I'm woken up by a blue, watery boy sitting on my chest, laughing. I felt like I was rising toward the ceiling. Then, the happy laughing feeling went away. I was more afraid than I've ever been in my entire life. I couldn't breathe, and it felt as though my face was being pressed against a hard surface. I tried to turn my head left and right, desperately trying to take in air. This went on for at least a minute before I felt myself drop back onto the bed, and it was all over. The next day I asked our landlady if a child had ever drowned at our house. She said no, but of course I couldn't get it out of my head. It still bothered me. When I bumped into an elderly neighbor a few days later, I asked her the same question. She told me nothing had happened at my house, but then she pointed toward the drive where we had been parking our car, and told me that it had happened over there. She told me that it had happened around Christmas, and that it was a terrible tragedy. She said that the family had had their kids and grandkids over when the little boy, 17 months old, had gone missing. In a panic, everyone had checked the river and the main road, but there was no sign of him. The police arrived an hour later and asked if the little boy could have gotten into the pool area, but it had been locked, and no one thought that that was a possibility. The officer went back there and pulled back the cover to reveal the small toddler floating against the bottom of the plastic. I feel like that was what I felt when my face was being pressed against something the night that I had my experience. My head was thrashing from side to side, trying to breathe. He was blue and soaked in water. He had been laughing and giggling just before the panic set in. My experience happened 6 years ago. I can still see his face when I close my eyes. I'll never know for certain what it was he was trying to communicate to me. I used to work as a security officer. I was asked to work a Saturday night shift at an old warehouse in Dudley. I turned up at 5 p.m. It was a huge brick building with some makeshift offices at the front. I walked in, took the keys from the day officer, and locked the doors behind him. Everything seemed normal for a while. It was a little creepy, as the building was so old, but I was used to that kind of environment. Around 1 a.m, I got a call from the warehouse manager. One of his night shift drivers had forgotten his paperwork, and he asked me to go into the office right at the back of the warehouse and collect it for him so that he could come pick it up. I said fine, and headed back there. The warehouse was pitch black. I had a small torch that only slightly lit my way. I walked through until I got to the office, which had a huge metal sliding door. It made a screeching noise as I pulled it open. The fax machine right in front of me as I walked inside was blinking, and the paperwork was in the process of being printed out. It finished, I grabbed it, then went to leave. As I turned around, however, I looked toward the other end of the office. When I did so, I saw what I can only describe as a dark figure hunched over, shivering. I could hear what sounded like breathing, the kind of shaking, rattling breathing of someone who is freezing cold. I stood there for about 30 seconds, motionless, staring at it. Then I turned back slowly, slid the door closed behind me, and rushed back to the front. I locked that door and waited for the driver. An hour later, the driver collected his paperwork, and for the rest of the night, I convinced myself that it was just the dark playing tricks on me. But it didn't stop me from checking the cameras every few minutes. 5 a.m. rolled around, and I got a knock on the door from the day officer. I handed him the keys, expecting him to come in, but he locked the door from the outside, so I asked him what he was doing. He told me that he doesn't go inside when he knows that no one is in there, that he sits in his car and waits. I told him I thought that was a bit strange. In response, he stared at me for a second before asking if I went anywhere other than the security office. I relayed the story of my having to go back to get the paperwork the night before, leaving out the odd bit naturally. I'll never forget the look that he gave me, or what he said next. His exact words were, "Well, then you know why I don't go in there alone then." I shrugged it off, basically just said, "Okay then," and left for home. But it gave me chills, and still does when I think about it. When I was 14, I had a strange encounter that continues to puzzle me years later. My parents are divorced, and sometimes on the weekends I would go to my mother's place. The house she lived in was a creepy old farmhouse that had been converted into several small apartments. It was between 150 to 200 years old. My mother told me off and on of odd sounds that she had been hearing, of seeing things out of the corner of her eyes, and routinely feeling as if she were being watched. One weekend when I spent the night, I brought my Nintendo 64 because my mom would go to bed early, and I would be awake for a few more hours. I was sitting Indian style on the floor playing, and had just finished a mission. I set the controller down behind and to the left of me. Directly behind me was a recliner. I'll never forget what happened next. I went to grab the controller, and there was a cloven hoof on the floor beside it. Insects and blood were coming from the sliver separating it. I slowly raised my eyes, and this demonic figure was staring back at me. It leaned down toward me, put its face in my face, and grinned the most evil smile. More evil than anything I could have imagined. It was a black-eyed, red-faced, one-winged monster. Blood dripped from its teeth. The moment was so surreal. I went into a panic attack and blacked out. I later discovered that reaction was my fight-or-flight response overwhelming me. I don't know how long that I was unconscious for. When I came to, I was laying on the floor, barely able to move. The entity was sitting in the recliner behind me, laughing. It was as if my fear, and my energy along with it, had been drained from me. I lost all strength. It took everything I could muster for me to crawl to my mom's room and wake her up. We talked, and she believed me. She told me that she, too, had seen the same being earlier that week. She hadn't mentioned anything out of her need to protect me, and not wanting to scare me. I don't think I'll ever know what to make of it. I have no doubt that demons and angels are real, and I know better than anyone that the last thing you want to encounter is a demon smiling in your face. In 1981, when I was 6 months old, my late parents purchased a 2-bedroom cottage. It had been abandoned for 2 years, and was in a somewhat dilapidated state. It had broken windows, holes in the floorboards, things like that. It looked like your stereotypical haunted house. From my understanding, the old woman who had lived in it previously had died, and it had been left to fall apart. Such was the case with a lot of old farms and cottages in the 80s and 90s. The cottage was around 200 years old, and was in a village about 8 kilometers north of Bristol. My parents spent nearly 4 years renovating the place so that we could move in. Until then, we lived in a flat just outside Bristol. While my parents were working on the house, they experienced a few strange encounters. Each morning before work, my father would drop my mother and I off at the house. My mother would take me to school in the village, then go back to the house to work as much as she could. After work, my father would collect us, take us back to the flat, then go back to the house himself to continue to work in the evenings. Many times, my parents spoke of feeling as if they were being watched, of knowing that they weren't alone. They would hear footsteps upstairs, hear doors open and close. My mother once heard heavy, disembodied breathing. Our family dog would also stare, seemingly into space, as if he were looking at something none of us could see. My parents didn't massively adjust the layout of the house as a later owner would, but they did add a third bedroom and a bathroom at the rear of the house. That was my room, which had previously been empty attic space above the kitchen. I never liked that room. In the mid-'80s, my aunt came to stay with us, and as her parents, my grandparents, were in the main bedroom, she had to sleep on the bottom bunk of my bunk bed. One night she heard the door open and close. A while later, the bunk bed started to shake violently. She told me to stop it, thinking it was me. When she realized it wasn't, that I was asleep, she shouted at whatever it was to stop. And it did. In the late 80s, I changed bedrooms to the front so that I could have more space. The rear bedroom became the guest bedroom. I was lucky enough to have both sets of grandparents. My parents were from the north of England and Yorkshire, about a 3-hour drive away. Every so often, various relatives would come and stay with us, usually on a weekend. My late maternal grandmother had a few experiences. Once in the 90s, she woke up to see a woman wearing what she described as either a Victorian or an Edwardian bonnet. The woman stood at the foot of the bed. She stayed there for a few minutes, and then she vanished. Another experience she had happened in 2001. She was washing up in the kitchen, standing in front of the kitchen window. Behind her were the stairs. She turned around and saw the faded shape of a woman's figure glide up the stairs, then turn left on the landing, going into the spare room. My late mother had a number of experiences as well in the 80s and 90s. She was in bed one evening. My father was downstairs watching the TV in the living room. She heard heavy breathing, as if from an elderly person. The next moment, she was being lifted off the bed and pulled toward the window. She was afraid that she was about to be thrown out, but then she glided back down onto the bed. As soon as she hit the mattress, she jumped up and ran downstairs to get my father. He ran up, and from what I've been told, he heard a loud sigh when he entered their room that made the hair on his neck stand up. Another experience my mother had was when she was lying down on the sofa. She could see through the next room, the little sitting room, and she could see the kitchen door. The kitchen door slammed shut, and my dog, who was in the sitting room, ran into the living room where she was at, frightened. My own experiences were mostly in my front bedroom. I remember in the 1980s when I had my bunk bed, which was to the left of the door. I was on the top bunk when the door opened. I turned to look, thinking it was my mother, only no one was there. The door promptly closed by itself. They were the type of doors that have a latch and button so that the wind or a draft can't open them. In the late 1990s, I remember opening the door to be hit by a gust of chilling air that came from nowhere. 2 nights after my mother's death in 1999, I recall a very vivid experience where I was talking to my mother. But to this day, I'm not sure if that was real or just a dream. I've never had anything else like that happen. Not before or since. A year or 2 after my mother's death, my father experienced what looked like 2 orbs in his bedroom floating around. He told me he felt as if he were being embraced. Around May of 2003, my father sold the house and moved about an hour away, while I moved closer to Bristol. He got remarried in 2003. He passed away in 2016. I haven't been back to that house since. When I was getting my master's degree, I moved to the big city of Washington, D.C. from rural New Mexico. For most of my time in D.C., I lived on campus, but for my last semester, a friend of mine received his first full-time appointment. An appointment is basically a pastorate, and it comes with a parsonage or a house for the clergy to live in. At the time, he was a single guy, and his parsonage was a big house. He decided to rent me a room to help me save a little money so that I could be ready to move for my first appointment next July. I agreed and moved into his guest room. It was a 50s-era house from what I could tell. It had been well taken care of. On the ground floor, there was a half-bath, kitchen, living room, and a small office. There was a basement, and on the second floor, there were 3 bedrooms. My friend had the main bedroom, which included its own half-bath. Next door to his room was the one full bathroom. Across from his room was my room, and next door to me was the guest bedroom. Each of these bedrooms had an access point to the attic, though none of them were connected by it. It always creeped me out. I'd hear weird noises from time to time, but nothing that I couldn't explain away. One night, I was lying in bed watching Breaking Bad, trying to fall asleep after writing a difficult theology paper. The only light in the room was coming from the TV, and from the moon as it streamed in through the window. In the shadows, I could have sworn that I saw something pounce from over by the door to the attic, toward me. It could have been my imagination. Perhaps I dozed off and it was some kind of nightmare. Or maybe it had been some kind of entity. Whatever it was, it freaked me out. I barely slept at all that night, and I turned my lights on. The next day, I rearranged the room. I placed the TV stand in front of the little door, blocked it, and lined my collection of Orthodox icons on top of the stand. I didn't live there much longer, but after that, the rest of my time seemed more peaceful. I work overnight in a funeral home. My shift begins at 7 p.m. and I get to go home at 6 in the morning. We've had some creepy things happen, and as somewhat of a paranormal aficionado, I have to admit that I am loving it. Quite often outside the preparation room where we embalm the bodies, we'll hear footsteps pacing in the hallway. At any given point, there are no more than 4 people in the building on a normal night. So, for 2 people to be in the prep room and hear this while everyone else is out on first calls would rule out the footsteps having belonged to any other co-workers. 2 to 3 times a week, the door to my office will close on its own. The other day, for example, I walked through the office door after getting a drink from our break room and went to the dressing area when the door slammed shut behind me. It also happens when I'm at my desk and totally alone in the funeral home. In the hallway outside my office with the self-slamming door, I can also hear footsteps pacing back and forth. I tend to simply close my office door for myself when this is happening, just to muffle it so I don't have to listen to it all. Switching back to the prep room, one night I was chatting with 2 other co-workers outside of it. We had just finished embalming someone and were chatting, taking a bit of a break before cleaning up and sterilizing everything. We were all standing outside the door when we heard something hit the far wall of the prep room and then hit the ground. Me being me, I went to investigate. It was one of our embalming tools, and we had all seen the last person to use it set it down on his prep table 30 feet away from where I found it laying. Admittedly, this next one was not my personal experience, but that of my coworker on a different shift. He swears that he was alone in the building while prepping somebody, and the phone on the wall started dialing out. It dialed to a funeral home in Missouri, the same funeral home that the person on the prep table was being shipped to. This last one is the most recent, having just occurred last night. We have industrial yellow cabinets that our flammable fluids are stored in. On top of those cabinets are plastic bins, which I won't go into the details of their intended purposes, but anyways. I walked around the corner just in time to see them fly off the top of the cabinet and scatter across the floor. I volunteered for a season at the Creepy Hollow Haunted House attraction in Texas just south of Houston. My assignment was to sit in a giant metal cage in the Fear Factory, which was a zombie-styled exhibit, and scream at people. I would bang on the walls, yell and shout, tell people I want to eat them. Normally we had 2 or 3 people in this cage, but this time it was just me due to staffing issues. I went through the night doing my thing, even won a Best Scare award for single-handedly doing the job. On my floor there was just me and one other volunteer who went up and down the stairs frequently. At around 11 that night, I started to smell sulfur and ammonia. I looked in the corner and to my surprise, I saw a giant figure crouched there. The walls in that room were roughly 8 feet tall, and that thing, whatever it was, looked to be somewhere between 10 to 12 feet in height, based on the way that it was having to hunch over. The best working description I've managed to come up with in regards to its physical appearance is that of a Slender Man-style frame, except that everything was black and scratchy like the pictures every kid in horror movies draw when they show their parents their so-called friend. The thing about the way it looked that stuck with me the most vividly through the years, though, would definitely be its eyes. It was like their gaze penetrated my soul. The other volunteer was, of course, downstairs while this whole encounter was taking place. A few customers came by, and I don't know if they couldn't see it or what, but they would without fail always walk right by it without so much as a second glance. After this happened a few times, I heard it speak. I heard it calling my full, legal name. I went by JP, so no one I worked with actually knew my name. At this point, I had no idea what was happening. I had some false sense of security because of the cage that I was locked in. I looked away from it and started praying, keeping my eyes shut tight. I can't explain what that thing was, or what attracted it to me, but believe me when I tell you I thought that those next 5 minutes would never end. I consistently felt as if it were easing its way over, creeping up on me the way a cat stalks its prey. Then it vanished, the smell of sulfur and ammonia disappearing along with it. That was when the other volunteer came back up the stairs. Customers kept coming the rest of that night. I never volunteered there again. After I spoke with some buddies, they told me that the sulfur and ammonia smell meant that it was probably a demon, but I truthfully don't know, and I don't think that I really want to. I work as a nurse at a hospital in the UK that was initially constructed during World War II. It was initially meant to be a temporary facility, but that ended up not being the case. It was further built upon and remains as a slightly modernized building. I recall doing a night shift during the winter time. There was a patient admitted to us with an infection, but we had no patients with illnesses that could affect cognitive function, i.e. dementia, learning difficulties, etc. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, the patient that I mentioned, the one with the infection, began to shout from the side room that they had been placed in. Another nurse and I responded. Once in the room, I tried to diffuse the situation and calm the patient down. All the while, the patient was screaming about how a man with a bag over his head had been standing at the foot of the bed, watching her. I could tell that something was off in the room. I felt a shift in the energy of the environment, despite telling the patient that there was nothing to be concerned about. Once we had her settled, the other nurse, who had gone in there with me, told me that as she turned to leave, she witnessed what could only be described as a shadowy figure. It passed through a set of double doors outside the room in which the upset patient resided. The doors are behind a small alcove, so you can't see them from that room, but once you leave the room, you can. After a few seconds, it clicked for both of us that the double doors are locked. They have to be unlocked with keys at each entry or exit. The amount of time that it took between us seeing the figure pass through that area versus the amount of time that it would have taken us to unlock said doors, go through them, and lock them again created an inexplicable impossibility. We both formed the conclusion that something otherworldly must have occurred right before our eyes. An entity of some sort had revealed itself to us. We returned to the desk, unnerved. When I was around 6 or 7 years old, my mother and I were on a routine grocery run to our local Walmart. I remember getting out of the car and walking up to the entrance. We had parked sort of in the back and had to go a little way to get there. As we were making our way, I noticed a homeless man asking for change from everyone walking by. When he asked the woman in front of us, she turned him away and he began to scoff at her, making rude remarks. We walked past him with haste, as he was becoming extremely agitated. We continued inside, got our groceries, and everything was fine. After we went through the checkout, I remember my mother taking out $2 to give to the man, who was still at the entrance. She wanted to hand him the money and be on our way without conflict, hoping to avoid being harassed like the woman in front of us had been. As we headed back toward the doors to leave, I raised my arms for my mother to pick me up. I was afraid of the encounter that we were about to have with the man. She picked me up, and we kept moving. Before the man could even ask us for the money, my mother gave him the cash, and we walked away just as she had hoped, conflict-free. At this point, I was being carried by her, my head on her shoulder, facing behind her. Halfway to the car, I looked up from the pavement. When I did, I made eye contact with the man who was staring directly at me with the most sinister expression on his face. His features were distorted, and what I can only describe as demonic. He was smiling and sticking his tongue out nearly down to his chest. He let out a long hiss, and his eyes rolled back into his head, seemingly invisible to the other people passing by. I still to this day do not understand how I could have been so far away, but have been able to hear him hissing as loudly as if his mouth had been placed right next to my ear. I'm sure it could be dismissed as some homeless guy on drugs combined with the overly active imagination of a small child. Still, though, even now, as an adult, I truly believe that this was a demonic entity that had possessed some poor soul during the lowest point of their life. Witnessing it in its true form messed me up for a long time, and has been a major factor behind my belief in the paranormal. I am a registered nurse. In my career of floor nursing, I have many stories, as I'm sure many nurses do. Here's one that comes to mind immediately for me. There was an older woman who, at the end of the shift, interrupted me while I was checking in on her. She raised her shaky, gnarled hand and pointed in my direction. "Could you please tell him to leave?" she asked. I turned around, seeing only the empty corner of the room behind me. "Who?" I replied. "Him," she insisted, her face completely serious. "I don't like him. Tell him to leave." I thought this whole interaction was strange. She wasn't a psych patient. She had no history of hallucinations or anything of that sort. "Ma'am," I told her. "There's no one there, ma'am. It's just you and I." She just kept staring at the corner. "No," she said. "There's a man in the corner wearing a dark hood. Tell him to leave." Not long after that, I finished my shift and went home. The next week when I came back, that patient was no longer in that room. After inquiring around with different coworkers, I found out that she had passed away 2 days after the night when she and I had our bizarre interaction. I still get chills when I think about it. When I first moved into the apartment that I'm currently living in, everything was fine. The only exception to this was occasionally at night, in the dark, I would see a shadow in front of my bedroom door. I tried to make out the details of the figure, but no matter how close I've been able to get at it, it has no real features. It only has shape. The form of a tall man wearing a hat and a long coat. Mind you, I'm in South America, and it's not common to see people wearing coats like that at all. I've never interacted with the shadow. Sometimes I'll feel uneasy, but will deliberately think of something else as I actively ignore the presence of the being. It's always in front of my bedroom door, however, so to go in and out of my room, I have to cross paths with it. My apartment is essentially a long corridor. The front door is immediately followed by the kitchen door on the right, then the living room, what used to be my mom's bedroom door, then mine, and the bathroom at the end of the hall with its door facing the entrance door at the other end. When I'm in my room looking out, there is only a blank white wall with nothing on it or around the area which could be mistaken for the shape of a human being. For the longest time, I thought that it was a figment of my imagination, or perhaps some sort of hallucinatory indicator that one day I might go mad entirely. Then, a high school friend of mine put me at ease one day when she confirmed that she could see it too. Everyone else has dismissed it, or claimed that I've been making it up. Granted, the friend I'm mentioning here could be considered very woo-woo, as it were. She's extremely spiritual, into Wicca and other occult practices. She may have been influenced by the fact that I told her about the shadow before she supposedly saw it. I will say, though, that she was truly, genuinely creeped out. She used to ask to use a detour coming home from school when she was walking with us because she wanted to avoid a certain cemetery. She always claimed to feel the presence of the spirits there and told us that if she wasn't careful, that they would try to follow her home. I never saw the eyes or smile of the shadow figure. It never said anything to me, not that I could hear. I could never make out the color of its coat, and I never considered what kind of hat that it was wearing. But it was undoubtedly a tall man, wearing both of those clothing items. I did nothing to get rid of it, but after a while I noticed it doesn't appear there anymore, as if nothing was ever there. I worked the night shift at a long-term care home for a while. I had a resident bell ring at 2:59 a.m., so I went in and asked her what she needed. She proceeded to scream that there was a man in her bathroom and that I needed to get him out. People wandering into other people's rooms wasn't an uncommon occurrence at that place, so it wasn't surprising or out of the ordinary. I asked her what the man looked like, and that's where the story takes a wild left turn. She told me that he was a black figure who had no face. I calmed her down and went over to the bathroom door and told whoever was in there that they needed to leave her alone. Then I went back to my charting. Around 3:10, I had another call bell ring from the other end of that same floor. I went to that resident's room and asked if he needed pain meds, which he was on at the time. He told me no, that the reason that he called me was because there was a quote-unquote creepy man with no face in his room, and that I needed to get him out. My blood ran cold. I had a nurse stay on the floor with me for the rest of that shift.